The engine rattled as she gripped the wheel, her weathered hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. At 65, Margaret Chin had driven these desert roads longer than most of these soldiers had been alive. They called her Grandma Driver, behind her back, laughing at the gray-haired woman who should have retired years ago. The young lieutenant barely glanced her way during the briefing, dismissing her with a wave like she was part of the furniture. But when the first explosion tore through the convoy and the radios went dead, when panic seized trained soldiers and the road ahead became a killing field, those same men who had mocked her age would learn something crucial. Experience doesn't fade with time. It sharpens. And the grandmother they'd underestimated was about to save every single one of their lives. The dust never settled at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. It hung in the air like a permanent haze, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that tasted of metal and distance. Margaret Chin stood beside her vehicle, methodically checking tire pressure with movements that had become ritual over 3 decades of military driving. Her hands, marked with age, spots, and thin scars, moved with practiced efficiency. She was 65 years old, the oldest active driver in the entire theater of operations. "Hey, Grandma!" A voice called across the motor pool. "You sure you don't need a nap before this run?" Laughter rippled through a cluster of young soldiers, their faces still smooth, their confidence still untested. Margaret didn't turn around. She'd heard variations of that joke for the past 5 years, ever since she passed 60 and refused to accept the retirement papers that kept appearing on her desk. Sergeant First Class David Ramos, 28 years old, swaggered closer. He was all lean muscle and bravado, the kind of soldier who filled every room he entered with noise. "Seriously, Chin, this route's got some rough patches. You need me to take over? Wouldn't want you throwing out your back." A few others snickered. Margaret straightened slowly, her knees protesting slightly, and met his eyes with a calm that made his grin falter for just a moment. "Your concern is noted, Sergeant," she said quietly. Her voice carried a particular authority that comes not from volume, but from decades of knowing exactly what words mean. "I'll manage." She turned back to her pre-flight check, dismissing him without another word. Ramos shrugged, playing to his audience. "All right, Grandma. Don't say I didn't offer." The briefing room was chaos barely contained. 50 soldiers crammed into a space meant for 30, maps projected on screens, showing routes through terrain that looked the same in every direction. Empty, hostile, unforgiving. Captain Morrison stood at the front, young enough to be Margaret's grandson, his uniform crisp, his authority still conscious of itself. "Listen up. We've got a critical evacuation. Battalion strength. Multiple vehicles. Time-sensitive intel suggests hostile activity in the region is escalating. We need everyone out of Firebase Osprey before sunset." He tapped the map. 2 possible routes. North Corridor is faster, but exposed. South Corridor adds 40 minutes, but provides better cover. "Who's lead driver?" someone called out. Morrison's eyes scanned the room and landed on Margaret, sitting quietly in the back row, her notebook open, already sketching the routes from memory. He hesitated, just for a second. That hesitation said everything. "Chun," he said finally, as if the name itself required extra weight. "You'll take lead convoy. Ramos, your second vehicle." A ripple went through the room. Not protest exactly. More like collective uncertainty. "Sir," Ramos spoke up, "wouldn't it make more sense to put someone younger on point? This is a battalion evac, not a supply run." Morrison's jaw tightened. Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes. The same calculation she'd seen in dozens of commanders over the years. Age versus experience. Optics versus capability. "Chun has more route hours than anyone in this room combined," Morrison said. "She takes lead. Any other questions?" Silence. Margaret closed her notebook and stood. Every eye in the room tracked her movement, measuring, doubting, waiting for her to fail before she'd even started. She was used to it. The convoy assembled at dawn. 15 vehicles, over 200 personnel, supplies, equipment, and one 65-year-old woman in the lead vehicle who most of them had never spoken to. Margaret performed her ritual, adjusted the rear-view mirror to map blind spots, touched the dashboard twice, fingers tracing a pattern only she understood. rolled her shoulders, feeling the old injury in her left one protest quietly. Her gloves went on last, worn leather that molded to her hands like a second skin. She'd learned to drive in mountains that made these desert roads look like highways. Her mother had been a transport driver during wartime, navigating impossible terrain with nothing but instinct and iron will. Margaret had sat in that passenger seat as a child, watching how her mother read landscapes like other people read books. Later, she'd driven aid convoys through war zones that no longer existed on maps. She'd evacuated civilians under fire. She'd navigated roads that mines had turned into graveyards. She had requested this position not because it was easy, but because she knew, deep in her bones, that drivers determined who lived and who died. All units, radio check. Morrison's voice crackled through the comm. One by one, vehicles reported in. Margaret keyed her mic, lead vehicle ready. Copy, lead. You have the route. North or south corridor. Margaret's eyes traced the horizon. The morning light hit the landscape at an angle that revealed textures invisible at other times of day. She saw the way shadows pooled in certain areas, the way the road curved near the exposed ridgeline. South corridor, she said. South adds 40 minutes. Ramos cut in. We have a timeline. South corridor, Margaret repeated, her voice unchanged. Morrison paused. Then, lead vehicle as discretion. South corridor it is. The convoy rolled out in a column, engines rumbling, dust rising in clouds that marked their passage like a signal flare. Margaret drove with the same steady pace she always did. Not fast, not slow, calibrated to terrain and load, and the mathematics of momentum. Behind her, she heard the chatter over the radio. Young voices, nervous energy, jokes that masked fear. Grandma's taking the scenic route, someone muttered, not bothering to mute their mic. Gonna be a long day, another voice agreed. Margaret's expression didn't change. She'd learned long ago that defending yourself to people who had already decided you were inadequate was like arguing with the wind. 30 minutes into the drive, the road split. North corridor stretched ahead, straight and fast. South corridor curved into rougher terrain, adding time and difficulty. Ramos's voice crackled over the radio. Lead, you sure about this? North is clear. Margaret's eyes tracked the northern route. Too clear, too convenient. The kind of route that planners loved and survivors avoided. Maintaining south, she said. Your call, Ramos replied, skepticism thick in his tone. The convoy followed. 50 minutes in, the first indication of trouble came not as a sound, but as an absence. The radio chatter that had been constant since departure simply stopped. Not static, not interference, just silence. Margaret's hands tightened on the wheel. Her eyes swept the terrain with renewed intensity. All units, comms check, she said calmly. Nothing. She tried again. Silence. Her foot eased off the accelerator. The vehicle behind her, Ramos, pulled closer, and she could see him leaning out, shouting something she couldn't hear. Margaret raised her left hand, palm out, then 2 fingers pointed down, then a closed fist. The gesture was old, older than most of the soldiers in this convoy, but the gunner in the second vehicle recognized it. His posture changed instantly, weapon swinging to scan sectors. Ramos saw the gunner's reaction, and his face paled. Margaret scanned the road ahead. The landscape looked empty, but emptiness in a war zone was never neutral. It was either safe or a trap, and Margaret had learned to tell the difference. She slowed further. Her eyes caught something, a pattern in the dirt that wasn't quite natural. Vehicle tracks, recent ones, but leading nowhere, circling back on themselves. Reconnaissance, observation, preparation. She keyed her mic knowing it wouldn't work, but following protocol anyway. Convoy, possible hostile observation. Maintain spacing. Eyes up. Still silence, but she saw vehicles behind her shift formation slightly. Someone was paying attention. The road ahead curved around a low hill. Standard route. Predictable. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She turned the wheel, leaving the road entirely. Behind her, she heard engines rev in confusion. Ramos's vehicle lurched to follow. Then another. Margaret drove across terrain that wasn't meant for vehicles, using slopes and depressions, moving perpendicular to the expected route. Her hands moved with absolute certainty, steering through gaps that seemed impossible, finding traction where logic said there was none. She'd driven roads like this before. Different continent, different war, same mathematics of survival. Behind her, younger drivers struggled to follow her line. Their vehicles pitched and bounced. Someone bottomed out with a grinding crash. But they followed because they had no choice, and because somewhere in their training, they'd been taught to trust the lead vehicle. Even when the lead vehicle was driven by a grandmother they'd been mocking an hour earlier. Margaret crested a small rise and stopped. Her hand went up again, different signal this time. The convoy froze. She climbed out slowly, her knees protesting, her back stiff. She walked to the edge of the rise and looked down at the northern corridor they hadn't taken. The road was gone. Not damaged. Erased. 3 impact craters spaced exactly where a convoy would have been if they'd maintained standard spacing at standard speed. Fresh. Recent. Waiting for vehicles that never came. Ramos appeared beside her, breathing hard. His face had lost all color. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Margaret studied the craters with professional detachment. IEDs. Command detonated. Position for a convoy our size. "How did you?" Ramos couldn't finish the question. Margaret didn't answer. She walked back to her vehicle, climbed in, and keyed the dead radio one more time. "Lead to any station. We have confirmed hostile activity North Corridor." South Corridor was correct call. Continuing evasion pattern. No response. But she hadn't expected one. She raised her hand. The convoy moved. 2 hours into the journey, the landscape changed. The open desert gave way to broken terrain, ravines, ridges, scattered rock formations that could hide entire armies. The kind of place where ambushes weren't just possible, they were inevitable. Margaret slowed to a crawl. Her eyes moved constantly, reading terrain the way her mother had taught her. Shadow patterns, wind effects, signs of disturbance that most people would never notice. She saw them before anyone else did. Small things. Tire marks that shouldn't exist on an unused trail. Disturbed gravel in patterns that suggested recent foot traffic. A reflective surface catching light where no natural surface should reflect. Observers. Spotters. People watching the road, waiting to report convoy movements. Margaret's face remained calm, but her mind accelerated. They were being tracked. The ambush on the northern route had been Plan A. This was Plan B, adapt and reposition. She raised her hand again, signaling the convoy to spread formation. Vehicles moved apart, breaking the predictable column. Gunners swung their weapons, scanning. Ramos's voice finally crackled through on a secondary channel, weak but functional. "Lead. We've got multiple possible contacts. What's the play?" Margaret's response was immediate. "Do not engage unless fired upon. Maintain dispersal. Follow my line exactly." "Your line is insane," someone else muttered. Margaret drove into what looked like impassable terrain, a narrow gap between rock formations that seemed too tight for a vehicle. She angled in at precisely the right approach, wheels finding purchase where eyes saw only obstacles. One by one, the convoy threaded through. Tight, terrifying, but possible. On the other side, the landscape opened into a broad depression, a natural bowl that provided cover from observation and clear sight lines for defense. Margaret stopped in the center, raised her hand. The convoy formed a defensive circle without being told, vehicles positioning instinctively now, following the geometry of her placement. "Lead, what now?" Ramos's voice held a new quality. Not quite respect yet. Recognition. Margaret climbed out again. Her movements were slower than the young soldiers around her, but they were deliberate, economical, wasting no energy. She walked to the center of the formation and knelt, pulling out a paper map, not digital, not satellite, paper. Hand-marked with notes and corrections accumulated over decades. Young soldiers gathered around her. Morrison appeared, having moved forward from the command vehicle. His face was tight with stress. "Chun, we need to keep moving. We have a timeline." Margaret traced a line on the map with one weathered finger. Current route is compromised. They're hurting us. Hurting us where? She pointed to a narrow pass 30 kilometers ahead. Here, natural choke point. Perfect kill zone. If we maintain current trajectory, we drive straight into it. Morrison studied the map. Alternative. Margaret's finger moved across terrain that looked blank on the standard military maps. But her map showed details. Old trails, dried riverbeds, forgotten paths that existed before this war, before this base, before most of these soldiers were born. We go through here, she said, indicating a route that didn't officially exist. It adds 3 hours. It's rough, but it puts us at Firebase Osprey from an unexpected direction. 3 hours, Morrison repeated. We'll miss the window. Dead men don't have windows, Margaret said quietly. The statement hung in the dusty air. Ramos stood close enough to hear, his earlier swagger completely gone. He looked at Margaret like he was seeing her for the first time. Morrison made his decision. Your route, Chun. Get us there alive. The unofficial route was everything Margaret had promised. Rough, slow, punishing the vehicles and nerves alike. But it was also empty. No observers, no tracks, no signs of hostile presence. Because no one expected a convoy to go this way. No one except a 65-year-old woman who remembered when these paths had been actual roads. She drove with absolute focus now, every sense calibrated to mission. When a vehicle threw a belt, she diagnosed it by sound before the driver reported it. When the terrain forced a decision between two impossible-looking paths, she chose unerringly, finding the one that would work. The soldiers stopped talking. They watched her instead, watched the way she navigated by landmarks they couldn't see, the way she timed movements to avoid bottlenecks before they formed, the way her hands on the wheel looked less like driving and more like conducting an orchestra. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and shadow, Firebase Osprey appeared on the horizon. The convoy had been silent for the last hour, exhaustion and tension draining the energy for conversation. Margaret keyed her radio. Firebase Osprey, this is evacuation convoy. Approaching from southwest vector. Requesting confirmation of secure perimeter. A moment of confused silence. Then, convoy, say again your approach vector. We were expecting you from north. North corridor was compromised, Margaret said. We rerouted. Stand by. 2 minutes later, a different voice came through, older, carrying authority. Convoy lead, this is Colonel Vance. Confirm your Margaretchen. Confirmed. A pause. Then something that might have been relief. Chun, we received intelligence 20 minutes ago that the North Corridor was hit. 3 IED strikes. They were positioned for a convoy your size. Another pause. If you'd taken that route. I know, Margaret said simply. How did you know to avoid it? Margaret looked at the road behind her, at the 15 vehicles that followed her through impossible terrain, at the faces of soldiers who had started the day calling her grandma and ended it trusting her with their lives. I listened, she said, and I remembered. The debriefing room was crowded, not just with her convoy, with staff officers, intelligence personnel, senior commanders who wanted to understand how a battalion-strength evacuation had succeeded when intelligence suggested it should have been a massacre. Margaret sat near the front this time, though she hadn't chosen the seat. Someone had pulled it out for her. Someone else had brought her water. The invisible woman had become very visible. Colonel Vance stood at the front, his expression grave. The northern corridor was hit exactly as predicted. 3 IED strikes, command detonated, positioned for standard convoy spacing and speed. If the convoy had taken that route, casualties would have been catastrophic. He looked at Margaret. Specialist Chun made the call to take South Corridor before any intelligence confirmed the threat. Then she rerouted entirely, using terrain that isn't on our standard maps. A intelligence captain spoke up. How did you know, Chin? What did you see that we missed? Margaret considered the question. How do you explain decades of experience? How do you quantify instinct built from 1,000 roads, 100 near misses, countless moments where the right decision meant the difference between life and death? The North Corridor was too perfect, she said finally. Too clean, too obvious. In my experience, the enemy doesn't leave you easy options unless they're trying to guide you somewhere. That's not intelligence, the captain said. That's intuition. Intuition is just experience you can't articulate, Margaret replied. Ramos spoke from the back of the room. She also saw the observation posts, the secondary ambush setup. He stopped, shook his head. She saw everything. Things I've been trained to look for and miss completely. Morrison leaned forward. Chun, your file says you've been requesting retirement for the past 2 years. Why are you still here? Margaret met his eyes. Because drivers matter. Because the person behind the wheel determines who makes a home. Because I'm not done yet. You're 65 years old, someone said. Not mockingly. Just factually. I am, Margaret agreed. I've also driven in 4 different theaters of operation over 3 decades. I've navigated routes that exist only in memory. I know how to read terrain that satellite imagery can't capture. Age hasn't taken that away. It's sharpened it. The room was silent. Colonel Vance cleared his throat. The Army has protocols about age limitations for active duty positions. But those protocols also include provisions for exceptional circumstances. He paused. Saving an entire battalion qualifies as exceptional. Over the next hour, the story emerged in full. The blocked radio communications, the evasion patterns, the impossible terrain navigation, the way Margaret had anticipated threats before they materialized. One by one, soldiers in the convoys stood to speak, not in formal testimony, but in something deeper, acknowledgement. I called her Grandma, Ramos said, his voice thick. I joked about her age. I didn't think she belonged here. He looked at Margaret. I was wrong. Completely, arrogantly wrong. A young private stood next. I'm alive because she knew things I don't even have words for. Because she's done this longer than I've been alive. Because she didn't need us to believe in her to save us anyway. Another soldier. Then another. The testimonials weren't flowery or dramatic. They were simple, honest, devastating in their sincerity. When the room finally emptied, Margaret remained seated, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Not the tiredness of age, but the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying responsibility for 200 lives across hostile terrain for 12 hours. Morrison approached, holding a folder. These are retirement papers. I'm supposed to offer them to you. Margaret looked at the folder, but didn't take it. I'm also supposed to tell you, Morrison continued, that the Army is creating a new training program, advanced route navigation and evasion. They want experienced drivers to teach the next generation. He paused. They want you to lead it. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. They want me to teach? Turns out institutional memory matters. Experience matters. And we've been stupid to waste it. Morrison set the folder down. Your choice, Chun. Retire with full honors and our gratitude. Or teach the young idiots like me what you know. Margaret looked at the folder, then at Morrison. Do I get to keep driving? Would it stop you if I said no? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. No. Then yes, you keep driving, but you also teach. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of a classroom of young soldiers, her hair grayer, her posture still straight, her eyes still sharp. Navigation isn't about maps, she told them. It's about reading landscapes like languages. Every terrain has a grammar. Every road tells a story. Your job is to learn to listen. In the back row, Ramos sat taking notes. He'd requested the course personally. Others from the convoy had done the same. The invisible grandmother had become the most requested instructor on base. During field exercises, Margaret drove the same vehicle she'd always driven. Same ritual, mirror, dashboard, shoulders, gloves. Same focus, same absolute certainty. But now, when young soldiers saw her approaching, they stood straighter. They listened harder. They asked questions not to challenge her, but to learn. One evening, a new lieutenant approached her hesitantly. Specialist Chun, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why do you still do this? You've proven everything. You could retire, rest, enjoy. Enjoy what? Margaret interrupted gently. Sitting still while people who don't know what I know make mistakes I could prevent? She shook her head. I'll rest when I'm done. I'm not done. The lieutenant absorbed this. How will you know when you're done? Margaret looked out at the motor pool, at the young drivers performing their pre-flight checks, at the roads stretching into the desert beyond. When I stop seeing the things that matter, she said. When age finally takes what experience gave me. When I can't trust my hands anymore. She flexed her fingers, still steady despite the years. That day hasn't come yet. Margaret Chin retired at 68, not because the Army forced her, but because she decided her students were ready. She created a legacy, dozens of drivers who navigated roads with her wisdom, who trusted their instincts, who understood that the most important person in a convoy isn't always the one giving orders. She'd saved hundreds of lives, not through single dramatic moments, but through decades of small decisions made correctly, of routes chosen wisely, of experience valued over ego. The Army renamed the advanced driving course after her. Young soldiers still learn her signals, her techniques, her philosophy. And on quiet mornings at the retirement home where she finally settled, Margaret still traces routes in a notebook, still remembers every road, still sees the patterns others miss. Some strengths don't fade with age. They deepen, sharpen, become something irreplaceable. Margaret Chin was just a driver, until her route evacuated an entire battalion, until they finally understood what they'd been too young, too arrogant, too certain to see. Experience doesn't retire. Wisdom doesn't fade. And the most dangerous mistake in any war is underestimating the quiet person who knows exactly what they're doing. True strength isn't measured by youth or volume. It's forged in experience, humility, and quiet competence. The most valuable people are often the ones we overlook. Age doesn't diminish capability. It refines it. Respect isn't owed to titles or appearances, but to those who prove their worth through actions, not words. Never underestimate someone because they don't fit your expectations of what a hero should look like. The greatest courage is continuing to serve when you no longer need to prove anything, when you do the work simply because you know it matters, and because you're the one who can do it best.